The night was colder than the steel towers she once ruled. Her tailored suit was wrinkled, her eyes swollen from tears, and for the first time in years, the world saw not a billionaire CEO, but a broken woman who had lost it all, her fortune, her empire, and the life she thought was unshakable. Sitting on the curb outside a run-down auto shop, she whispered through trembling lips, "I lost everything." But then, from grease, stained hands, and a voice that carried no judgment, the mechanic looked at her and said softly, "You still have her." Those words pierced deeper than any loss could cut. Who was she? And why did this man, a stranger with nothing but a humble garage, speak as though he held the missing piece to her shattered world? This wasn't just the story of a woman who fell from the top. This was the story of what truly remains when everything else is stripped away, and how sometimes the one thing we overlook is the very thing that saves us. The night had an unforgiving chill, the kind that made every breath sting and every silence echo louder than it should. She sat there on the curb, her body trembling more from defeat than the cold, staring at the cracks in the pavement as though they mirrored the cracks spreading through her life. Just days ago, she had stood at the top of the world, her name carved into the skyline, her empire stretching across continents. Boardrooms trembled when she entered, competitors bent under her strategies, and the press hailed her as untouchable. But the very world that once applauded her rise had now devoured her fall with the same hunger. The markets collapsed, scandals spread, and allies vanished faster than smoke in the wind. She had spent her life building walls of glass and steel around herself, only to watch them shatter in a single, brutal moment. The shareholders abandoned her, the banks pulled their strings, and the headlines screamed her failure for all to see. She was no longer the vision of power and elegance in flawless heels and tailored suits. Now, her hair was tangled, her clothes wrinkled, and her once commanding voice was reduced to broken whispers. No chauffeur, no driver, no private jet waiting. Just her, stranded in a part of the city she had once passed through without noticing, as though it belonged to a different world entirely. She pressed her face into her hands, the taste of salt and mascara clinging to her lips, muttering the same words over and over. "I lost everything." The words were heavy, final, a verdict she had no strength to appeal. She thought of the tower she once owned, floors of glass shimmering against the skyline, now swallowed by creditors. She thought of her so-called friends, the ones who used to laugh at her table, sip her champagne, and chase her approval, now silent, unreachable, pretending they had never known her at all. Every memory of her success mocked her. She remembered walking into packed auditoriums, applause shaking the air as she spoke about leadership and vision, while secretly her own heart was chained by loneliness. Now, stripped of the empire, the applause, and the adoration, she was left with nothing but the raw truth of her own fragility. The city that once celebrated her name now treated her like a ghost. No one stopped to look, no one cared to notice. She had never felt so invisible, so painfully ordinary, so human. Her body shook with a mixture of rage and sorrow. How could everything she had given her life to vanish so quickly? How could years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and victories dissolve into ruins within weeks? The humiliation stung worse than the loss itself. She had defined herself by her empire, her titles, her victories. And now, without them, she didn't know who she was anymore. She only knew she was empty, hollow, and utterly defeated. Whispering those same words to the night, praying someone, anyone, might hear her. The words lingered in the air longer than she expected, almost louder than the traffic rushing by. She lifted her tear-streaked face toward the man kneeling beside her, his hands still stained with oil and grease from the car he had been fixing just minutes before. His tone had not been dramatic, nor filled with pity. It was simple, steady, as though he was telling her a truth she had forgotten. "You still have her." For a moment, she thought she had misheard him, but the softness in his eyes told her she hadn't. Confusion mingled with the ache in her chest, twisting into something sharper. Her lips parted to ask who he meant, but no sound came out. She wanted to demand answers, to tell him not to toy with her grief. Yet something in his calm expression kept her silent. This was a man who worked with his hands, who likely lived paycheck to paycheck, a man she would never have noticed before her fall. And yet, here he was, speaking words that cut deeper than any headline about her downfall. Her. The word echoed in her mind like a riddle, awakening corners of her heart she had buried beneath years of ambition. Was he talking about her mother, the one who had stood by her in her earliest days, but passed away before she could see the empire her daughter built? Was it the memory of her younger self, the little girl who once dreamed under the stars before skyscrapers replaced the sky? Or perhaps he meant the daughter she had left behind in the shadows of her boardrooms and meetings. The little girl whose calls she missed, whose school plays she skipped, whose drawings sat unopened on her desk. Forgotten beneath stacks of contracts. Her throat tightened, and for the first time since her empire crumbled, the tears that filled her eyes weren't only from loss, they were from guilt. She had told herself for years that she was working for her, sacrificing time for a greater future, but in reality, she had let the world of wealth and power consume her until she barely remembered what mattered. The mechanic didn't need to say more. His silence was louder than a lecture. His presence a reminder that sometimes a stranger could see what even your closest allies refused to say. Her fingers trembled as they traced the edges of her phone in her pocket, the weight of unreturned calls pressing heavier than the fall of her empire. If she truly still had her, then maybe everything wasn't lost. Maybe the love of one soul was worth more than the applause of millions. She hadn't expected to find clarity on a cold curb outside a grease-stained auto shop. But sometimes truth didn't arrive in polished speeches or glamorous boardrooms. Sometimes it came from a man with dirt under his nails and kindness in his eyes, reminding her of the one person she still had, the one person she could not afford to lose.